नमस्कार, मी निमेश वहाळकर. महा MTV आणि साप्ताहिक विवेक तर्फे आपणा सर्वांचं स्वागत. आज आपण एका अत्यंत महत्त्वाच्या मुद्द्यावरती चर्चा करणार आहोत आणि तो मुद्दा आहे चीनचा. चीन हा खरं तर आपला शेजारी देश, परंतु आपल्यापेक्षा पूर्णपणे भिन्न मानसिकता, भिन्न दृष्टिकोन असलेला देश आहे. कम्युनिस्ट पक्षाची या संपूर्ण देशावरती पकड आहे. कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी म्हणजेच हा देश असं जिथे समीकरण आहे. भारताला स्वातंत्र्य मिळाल्यापासून आजपर्यंत आपले चीनशी असलेले संबंध हा कायमच एक संवेदनशील विषय राहिलाय. मग तो सीमावादाचा विषय असेल, भारताच्या सीमेवर चीनच्या सातत्याने होणाऱ्या कुरघोडींचा विषय असेल, किंवा चीनच्या व्यापारी आर्थिक वर्चस्ववादाचा विषय असेल. त्या सगळ्यामागे चीनची सामाजिक राजकीय जडणघडण, तेथील नेतृत्वाची एकूण मानसिकता किंवा दृष्टिकोन, जागतिक राजकारणाच्या पटलावर चीनचं स्थान ते कशा प्रकारे पाहतात हे जाणून घेणं आवश्यक ठरतं. याच विषयावरती चर्चा करण्यासाठी आज आपल्यासोबत उपस्थित आहेत भारताचे माजी परराष्ट्र सचिव विजय गोखले. विजय गोखले यांनी जवळपास 4 दशकं IFS अधिकारी म्हणून सेवा दिलेली आहे. देशाच्या परराष्ट्र धोरणाशी संबंधित अनेक महत्त्वाच्या पदांवर त्यांनी काम केलेलं आहे. मलेशियामध्ये ते भारताचे उच्चायुक्त होते, जर्मनीमध्ये ते भारताचे राजदूत होते आणि सर्वात महत्त्वाचं म्हणजे चीनमध्ये भारताचे राजदूत म्हणून त्यांनी काम केलेलं आहे. भारताचे 32वे परराष्ट्र सचिव म्हणून 2018 ते 2020 अशा कार्यकाळामध्ये ते कार्यरत होते. विजय गोखले यांनी चीनच्या संदर्भात नुकतंच एक पुस्तक लिहिलं आहे, द लॉंग गेम, हाऊ चायनीज निगोशिएट विथ इंडिया असं या पुस्तकाचं नाव आहे. आणि गोखले यांच्यासारख्या भारतीय परराष्ट्र धोरणामध्ये वरिष्ठ स्तरावरती काम केलेल्या डिप्लोमॅटने लिहिलेलं हे पुस्तक असल्याने त्याला अर्थातच एक मोठं महत्त्व आहे. याच पुस्तकाच्या अनुषंगाने चीनचा स्वभाव आणि त्याचे मनसुबे जाणून घेण्याचा प्रयत्न आपण आजच्या या मुलाखतीच्या माध्यमातून करणार आहोत. आणि या मुलाखतीमध्ये संवादक म्हणून उपस्थित असतील ॲडव्होकेट किशोर जावळे. ॲडव्होकेट जावळे हे ज्येष्ठ वकील आहेत. मुंबई उच्च न्यायालयात गेल्या 4 दशकांहून अधिक काळ त्यांनी प्रॅक्टिस केलेली आहे. कायदा, संविधान या विषयांवरती अर्थातच त्यांचं संशोधन आणि अभ्यास आहेच, परंतु आंतरराष्ट्रीय राजकारण, समाजकारण, इतिहास, तत्वज्ञान या शाखांचाही त्यांचा गाढा अभ्यास आणि संशोधन आहे. त्यांनी यामध्ये विपुल लेखन केलेलं आहे. मी साप्ताहिक विवेक आणि महा MTV तर्फे या दोन्ही मान्यवरांचं, विजय गोखले सर आणि ॲडव्होकेट किशोर जावळे सर, या दोघांचंही स्वागत करतो आणि या मुलाखतीची पुढील सूत्र मी जावळे सरांकडे सोपवतो.
Welcome viewers to our program today, and as you all know, we have been honored by the presence of Shri Vijay Gokhale ji, who has been, as we know, our ex-foreign secretary, as well as he has been India's ambassador to China and is known in the country to be one of the most eminent sinologists that we have. Welcome Gokhale ji to our program. We are really honored by your presence here. Without any further loss of time, yes, let me begin straight away. The most obvious question that comes to one's mind first is, you being a career diplomat all throughout your life, what exactly prompted you to write on this particular subject, which is a rather special and specified subject? What is it that prompted you to write on this, the negotiating skills of diplomatic corps, comparative negotiating skills of diplomatic corps of India as well as China?
Zawalji, thank you first of all for inviting me on this program. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to be on the program. Thank you also for talking about my book. This is a very interesting question you ask, because surprisingly, this is the first time that I have been asked this question. And I thought the answer was rather obvious, which is that there are a lot of excellent books on India-China relations, written both by people who have practiced diplomacy as well as very well-known academics and researchers. So I didn't want this to be simply another book on diplomacy between India and China. On the other hand, I found after retirement, when I went through various virtual libraries, that I couldn't lay my hands on a single book where we discussed the manner in which the Chinese negotiated with us over a long span of time. So we have a number of books on how they negotiated with us, for instance, between 1950 and 1962 on the India-China boundary issue. There are also a few books about negotiation over Tibet, but it stops there. And I felt that, therefore, there was a literary space, as it were, for me to fill. And I felt I had a core sort of unique selling point, if you put it that way, because I had been practicing this particular aspect of diplomacy from the early 1980s, when I first joined Indian delegations when they went to China to negotiate. And of course, I concluded my career as the Foreign Secretary, where I headed those delegations. So that sort of made it natural for me to write this book. And I enjoyed it, but ultimately, of course, it is for the readership to decide how useful or otherwise it is.
Thank you. See, what I find, especially from the first two chapters of the book, The Long Game, how China negotiates with India, you have made out a narrative that at the time the communists assumed power in China in 1949, and we had become independent in 47. The Indian diplomatic community, if at all there was one, was lacking totally in experience in dealing with outside powers independently, conducting diplomatic negotiations, whereas comparatively, the Chinese had an experience in the sense that, as you have said in your book, that China was never under foreign rule in the sense that we were. And therefore, they had an independent government of their own, especially after 1911, when the Qing dynasty rule finally ended and the Kuomintang came to power. And they have been dealing with the outside world. And as such, they had their own diplomats dealing with this, their international relations, and they had acquired some sort of expertise or experience in the field. But intriguingly, recently I read an interview by one journalist and defense analyst, Mr. Peter Martins, given to the Hindu on the 25th of July, 2021, where he says that the Chinese diplomatic corps, as it was, belonged to the Kuomintang and therefore had this experience in dealing with the outside world, was practically hounded out of China by the communists after they assumed power. And along with the Kuomintang government, this diplomatic community also fled Chinese mainland, and went to the then island of Formosa, which we now today know as Taiwan. And therefore, Mr. Martins uses these words, a ragtag group. He says that what the Chinese had in their hand was a ragtag group. And to that ragtag group, because they had absolutely no experience in conducting negotiations, Zhou Enlai had a meeting with them, and he said that because of this lack of experience, what you do is you emulate the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and two tenets of the PLA. One, absolute and unswerving commitment to party ideology and the party. And the second, the PLA's motto, not to concede an inch of territory, Chinese territory, to anyone. So you do the same thing in the diplomatic field, what the PLA is doing elsewhere. Now, this narrative that Martins builds seems to run counter to what you have said about the lack of experience of the, the experience, not the lack of experience, I'm sorry, the experience that the Chinese had even prior as under the Kuomintang, and they inherited that experience. Now, how do we reconcile these two positions? Is Martins right when he says this, or what is the truth exactly?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I have read Martins' book. It's called China's Civilian Army. Yes. Now, essentially, what he says in that book is that the diplomatic corps, in fact, was treated like the civilian wing of the armed forces in terms of achieving China's objectives. Now, while he is accurate in saying that a number of diplomats who were serving the earlier government, the so-called nationalist government of China, either fled to Taiwan or were dismissed,
Right.
There was a speech that Premier Zhou Enlai had given in November of 1949. I've read that speech. Now, in that speech, he very carefully says that while these diplomats would not be given frontline diplomatic work, they could be retained as advisors. So, in a sense, while the frontline diplomats may all have been the new communist followers, there was a certain expertise and institutional memory that they retained by keeping some of the KMT's diplomats on as advisors. But much more importantly than that, when I say that China had greater diplomatic experience than we did, was the fact that during the so-called liberation struggle, the Chinese leadership engaged much more intensively with foreign countries than we did. For instance, right from 1927 until 1949, there were Soviet advisors in the Communist Party, people like Borodin or Pavel Mif. And Stalin himself used to interfere time and again. And therefore, Mao and the other Chinese leaders had to sharpen their diplomatic skills to ensure that the Soviet-led Comintern International did not simply swamp them. Because as you know, Stalin's goal was for the Communist Party to merge with the Nationalist Party and then to make revolution from within. So they had good experience in navigating the Soviets, who were there, on the one hand, their benefactor, but on the other hand, wasn't fully supporting them. Then you will recall during the so-called anti-Japanese war, which we know as the Second World War, where Mao and the communists were in the base at Yan'an, the Americans put an official military mission there. And again, the idea was that the Americans were preparing for a post-World War standoff with the Soviet Union, and they recognized that China was crucial. So the American military mission was also somebody that Mao and the others were dealing with. And after the Second World War, the Americans tried to broker the deal between the communists and the nationalists. So Mao had experience dealing with the Americans as well. And of course, with the Japanese, there was experience because they were fighting the Japanese. So in a sense, my point is that the leaders of communist China had hands-on experience in dealing with foreigners. Now, in contrast, with the exception of Nehru, and that also with very limited opportunity, no other Indian leaders were really negotiating with foreign leaders. Most of our negotiations were with the British Empire and with, of course, the Muslim League and other so-called political outfits who were not part of the Congress. Therefore, the conclusion I came to was that there was a lack of experience, relative inexperience is the word I use, in dealing with foreign countries in India. Whereas in China, the leadership had more experience than that. Now, notwithstanding that, I entirely agree with Peter Martin's whole analysis, which is that the Chinese diplomats were effectively a civilian army. Their mental approach was different from ours, and perhaps we were not able to gauge that.
Yes, and it makes sense in the sense where what you said just now, that the motivation for the Communist Party to see that they acquire the necessary skills of negotiations in dealing with outside power came from the fact that the Kuomintang, even after they went to Taiwan, were competing for political space with the Communist Party, with the PRC on the international level. And therefore, they realized the importance of acquiring that skill if they wanted to get an upper hand over the Taiwanese dispensation. I think the whole thing makes sense now as to why the Chinese Communist Party took extra care to see that they acquire the kind of skills that are required, maybe vicariously through the Russians or through whoever, but they did that. Now, reading your book, I sense that though the main subject is negotiating skills, art of conducting diplomatic negotiations, I also felt that there is an underlying theme which is rather understated, remained understated. And that is, at one place, if I may be permitted to borrow your own words, that the approach of the Indian side was a mixture of emotionalism and conjecture. And then you say there was no strategy. Now that last sentence for me is extremely important. That we didn't have the strategy, we didn't have a strategic vision or a game plan. We didn't know what we were negotiating for. We are getting into negotiations with the Chinese. What do we want to get out of it? Now, we would like you to elaborate on two things in this connection. Firstly, do you think that this lack of strategic vision was confined to the then political dispensation, which was the ruling political leadership, which was the ruling dispensation, or you feel that it was an aspect which was all pervading throughout the political leadership of India, irrespective of whatever ideological leanings that they may have? They simply did not have or did not pay attention or did not feel the urge to pay attention to the larger picture that they ought to have had when they embarked upon India's journey as an independent nation in 1947. This is the first one, and I will also put the second one. What would you attribute this lack of strategy or strategic thinking on the part of the Indian side or the Indian leadership? So these are the two aspects which we would like you to elaborate upon.
Thank you. Would you mind if I reverse the two questions and
the
second one first?
Stop privilege.
Zauriji, let's leave aside the relative diplomatic inexperience which we have talked about. There is certainly a case to be made for the lack of a strategy in the early years after independence. Now, I want to very clearly distinguish between the strategy and the vision. There is no doubt that analytically, the government of India was able to recognize that the nationalist government was not going to survive and that they needed to deal with the communists. And therefore, also there was the vision that when the Communist Party establishes itself, then India and China need to work together to create a new order in Asia after the Second World War. So the vision was very much there. But a strategy has to be based not simply on a vision, but also an objective analysis of facts on the ground. Now here, to some extent, our own approach was determined by the freedom struggle, by Gandhiji's philosophy of ahimsa or non-violence, which effectively translated to mean we achieve our objectives through peaceful negotiations or through peaceful protest. Was this China's vision? Perhaps we should have inquired. We didn't. Now, had there been even a rudimentary inquiry, we would have realized that in public discourse, including in interviews given to foreign journalists like Edgar Snow, Mao had very early on clearly indicated two things. Firstly, he had indicated that as far as he was concerned, revolution meant use of force. You could not change things through peaceful negotiations. And his famous words were, the revolution is not a dinner party.
Correct.
The second thing that was evident was more than one statement by Chinese leaders that when they liberated China, the Mohammedan and Tibetan parts, I'm now using his own words, the Mohammedan and Tibetan parts would come back to New China. This was a public interview. So in other words, they had already publicly stated that as and when they came to power, recovery of Tibet and Xinjiang and any other parts of China which had separated from them would be brought back. Now, given the fact that we had an embassy in Beijing and a consulate in Lhasa, we perhaps, it is my assumption, did not use these facilities at our disposal to probe the Chinese a little more on what their thinking and expectations were. Therefore, my conclusion was that instead of having a strategy based on a coherent understanding of the new Chinese positions, we were simply carried away by the emotion that these were two rising Asian powers and by the conjecture that the Chinese post-Second World War shared our perception of the way in which the world should be shaped. And I think this was very clearly established soon after the Chinese took power, because within a year they used force to regain Tibet, to put the PLA there. Surely that should have alerted us. But even then, despite the letter by Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel and a number of observations by former civil servants like Girija Shankar Vajpayee, who was then governor of Bombay, the government of Prime Minister Nehru continued to believe that peaceful negotiation was the only way forward. So that is why I say that perhaps the policy was more based on conjecture or assumption or emotion rather than cold strategy. But I now come to the second part of your question. And I believe that over the years, particularly after 1962, there has been a much more realistic and hard-headed assessment of China. For instance, I certainly would quote three examples. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who between 1971 and 1975 conducted the Bangladesh War, the nuclear test, and the merger with Sikkim, all of which had a China dimension to it. Fully understanding and comprehending that while China was a threat to us, but they had some internal issues to deal with, and that the timing was apposite for us to take action. The second example is Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and his nuclear tests, or the government's nuclear tests, right, where we named China as a reason for our conducting those tests, and subsequently managed diplomacy in a way which enabled us to basically get de facto recognition of our status, and at the same time to not let the Chinese isolate us. The second part of those nuclear tests, and I think this is the more important part of what Prime Minister Vajpayee did, was that he showed us that we could withstand sanctions by the entire UN Security Council. It gave us a confidence we had lacked for many years. So I would give that as the second example. And of course, I would certainly give the third example with the current government of Prime Minister Modi in matters relating to the India-China boundary question. Now, here I would not like to go into any detail because I was part of this, and at this stage, I think when the situation is still delicate, any further comment might be misconstrued or might disadvantage the government. But I think the point that was being made here was that there was a hard-headed realism that if sovereignty or territorial integrity was being compromised in any manner, then the government of India would take necessary action, even at substantial cost to itself, in order to reassert our sovereignty and integrity. So the short answer to your first question is that there has been an evolution of strategic thinking in the positive direction. And I would certainly say we have today reached a point where the policy, our national security and foreign policy is certainly made based not only on vision, but also on hard-headed analysis of the facts.
Thank you. See, I was struck when I was reading Bruce Riedel's book, JFK, CIA and the China-Tibet Sino-Indian crisis, in which he gives an instance of the 2nd of October, 1950, on the midnight when K.M. Panikkar was summoned by Zhou Enlai and to his house. And casually, Zhou Enlai dropped this bombshell that they had learned that possibly the Americans under Douglas MacArthur were thinking of crossing the 38th parallel after having liberated South Korea. They wanted to come into North Korea. And he said that that is not a good idea. And if the Americans did that, then China would definitely militarily intervene, knowing fully well that this message would eventually reach Washington via Delhi. Which it did, because no sooner than he returned to the embassy, Panikkar contacted Nehru, and Nehru in turn told Washington. And when disregarding that, the Americans marched into North Korea, and then we know the rest is history. What struck me was, I was reading another book by Major General Pitre, in which he gives the instance that after the 1950 Korean War, there was the field commanders in the Indian Army had sent a proposal that we should study and prepare a white paper on the tactics adopted by the Chinese in South Korea at that point of time, by which they were able to keep the Americans at bay. And that idea was struck down by the military leadership at that point of time. And yet in 62, having this experience with us, that when the Chinese sense that there is a threat to their vital interests, they will not hesitate to militarily intervene. And they had done so against a much more formidable opponent as the US. We embarked on our forward policy in 62. And some or the other, whether I was reading Mr. B.N. Malik's account of it or Nehru's account of it, I found that we went on the presumption that in spite of our forward policy, our platoons and companies going there, the Chinese, except recording their protests, would never militarily hit back. Now, this lack of strategy part seems to have been persisting right up to 62, even after our experience in 1950. So my question was rather slightly general. It was not specifically China specific. In general, we seem to be lacking in having a larger strategic picture, and therefore an imminent ad hocism creeps into our policy time and again. But it was really, really good to hear from you right now that we seem to have come a long way from those early years, and now we seem to be having a better understanding of our position here and our future on the international scene. But then, talking about 62, what I find that it is a rather surprising omission. The entire 62 episode is not there in the book. And when I was carefully following your interview with Jyoti Malhotra of The Print, you said that I have kept that out of the book. Now, I am more curious, and our viewers are curious to know as to what was the reason to keep the 62 episode out of the book.
Actually, I kept the entire boundary issue out of the book because it is still a matter under negotiation. And anything I would have said or done, because I was part of these negotiations for the better part of 30 years, might give the Chinese some insights, I presume, about our thinking or our rationale. And somehow I felt that was simply not an ethical thing to do or something which was desirable from any perspective. Therefore, you will note that all the 6 case studies or instances that I take up in my book are all incidents which have had closure. I have not taken any incident where there is still an ongoing discussion or an ongoing negotiation with the Chinese side, because I'm always conscious that we should not compromise the government's position or stand on the subject. It's as simple a reason as that. And besides, there are plenty of other books written on the subject. So I don't think I would have greatly enlightened anyone.
Right. See, I was just reading Colonel Younghusband's letter that he wrote in 1904 after the Simla Accord to his wife, in which he says at one place that having known the scorpion, into bracket China, the frog, into bracket British India, appears to be divine. So he draws the parallel from that parable of the frog and the scorpion, where he says that it is in the nature of the scorpion to sting and bite, even if it eventually ends up in killing itself, which is what it does in that story of the frog and the scorpion. Do you feel that we somehow or the other not hard-headed, or were not, today it may be different, we're not hard-headed and realistic enough to realize that affairs of the world are conducted by their own logic, and we couldn't simply read China as well as the British did way back in 1904.
There's no doubt there was an idealistic perception which hung over Indian foreign policy for many, many years. Part of it, I would say, was certainly the outcome of our freedom struggle. And the whole concept of ahimsa or non-violence, and the manner in which we believed, or we led ourselves to believe, that the overthrow of the British Empire had happened only because of peaceful negotiation. Now, that, of course, spilled over into foreign policy because essentially the same movement which led the freedom struggle then became the government of India. And what I do mention, I haven't mentioned this specifically in my book, but I've hinted at it, is that once we became the government, they did not construct a larger foreign policy system or structure. Beyond establishing the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Foreign Service, they simply did not plug in other talent into the government, whether it was other political parties, whether it was academia and research, whether it was external expertise, which should have fed into the system. Now, if we look at the way the Americans conducted foreign policy, or the British, or even the Chinese, they have a whole structure which supports the government. This includes think tanks, universities, research institutions, certain selected individuals with foreign policy experience. There is a consultative process. Leaders often call people from the outside to take soundings and so on. That was lacking in the early years after independence. And from the records that I perused, which are available publicly in the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, it was quite evident to me that a number of decisions were simply taken by a very small group of people. And I quote one instance in the book where Deputy Prime Minister Patel has suggested that the Prime Minister inform the cabinet about the recognition of China. And the Prime Minister writes back to say that none of his cabinet colleagues were very interested in the subject. To my mind, the issue was not whether the cabinet colleagues were interested in the subject or not. My view is, if we are following a cabinet form of government, then it is incumbent to consult the cabinet. And therefore, I think the process itself, the system had not developed. So this is something which over the years has changed. And certainly, I doubt that what happened in those early years will happen again now.
Right. With that, I would rather now turn to another subject, which may not be directly concerning our book. And that is, especially post-COVID pandemic, China has seemed to embark upon this wolf warrior diplomacy all throughout the world. From Ladakh to Himalaya to the South China Sea, against Taiwan, against Philippines, against Vietnam. Simultaneously, they seem to have opened these different fronts, trying to thrust and trying to push themselves over these countries. Especially since Xi Jinping has acquired almost the kind of halo that Mao had. Now the question is, China seemed to be almost unstoppable prior to the pandemic. And the various countries in Europe, the various countries at other places, take the instance of countries like Australia. They felt that they had a future with China. They coupled their economies with China, and they were looking very positively towards, apart from the political aspect, that there would be a new system, order of the world which would emerge, in which China will be co-opted, China will be part of the overall system. All that changed after the pandemic, and that was not because of anything that others did, but China did. And suddenly, the entire atmosphere for China seemed to have gone negative. I don't know whether they knew that this would happen. I don't know whether they had factored this when they embarked upon this phase of aggression, as I would say. And the second step of it, which recently we find, is the Chinese crackdown on their own edtech and fintech companies. It appears that the apparent logic behind is that the CCP, the Communist Party of China, fears that these companies, which have acquired a tremendous financial and economic muscle, may eventually be in a position to undermine the Communist Party's grip on power in China, and therefore they need to be cut down to size. And they started with a crackdown on Jack Ma and his Alibaba, and now it has gathered speed, and a lot of companies have gone asunder. Now, what we would like to know from you, as you are an observer, you have an insider's view of these Chinese, as to whether this logic is at play or there is something more than meets the eye in this whole episode. Because earlier we find that there have been instances in Chinese history, like even during the Qing dynasty, the initial stages, when during the consolidation period, they give full freedom to their entrepreneurial class. It achieves tremendous economic and financial muscle. And then they become apprehensive about their rising power and cut them down to size, in the process hitting themselves. Now, is it something that history is repeating? Is this the logic, or there is something else and something more behind what is happening in China and its internal dynamics with this in connection with this issue? That is what we would like to know.
So coming to the first question, Zauriji, the wolf warrior diplomacy, to my mind, is simply another tactic. Tactically, the Chinese are very adept diplomats. And, when Peter Martin described them as a ragtag bunch, unfortunately, that was an impression based upon what the West expected diplomats to look and sound like in the 1940s, with the tuxedo and the black bow tie and elegant French or English. Regrettably, I think we too fell for that myth. And therefore, we underestimated what this ragtag bunch could do. But of course, as I explained to you, while they may not have had the dress and deportment of a Western diplomat, they were very skilled at diplomacy. Now, the interesting example you quoted about Zhou Enlai calling Panikkar on the night of the 2nd of October 1950 to give the ultimatum that if the Americans crossed the 30th parallel, that the China would attack, is a typical case of the way in which the Chinese conducted diplomacy. Because we now have enough factual evidence based on declassified Chinese records to show that actually Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong had great contempt for Nehru. Despite that, they used him, as you correctly said, to pass messages. So in other words, they tailor their diplomacy to the requirements of their objectives. At that time, it served them to use India as a conduit because, as you correctly said, they knew the message would go. And it went. Today, the wolf warrior way of conducting diplomacy is another way to pass a message. But as I explained in my book, words and gestures by China do not convey meaning, they convey messages. They do not convey emotion, they convey messages. And therefore, it is important that we don't fall into what I would say is a Western perception of looking at wolf warrior diplomacy as a new phenomenon. We set it aside as a tactic and we focus on what Chinese strategy is. And that strategy is clear. It is to make the Chinese Communist Party the world's global hegemon. Because ultimately, today's China is the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the very initial comments you made when we began the conversation, that the diplomats and civil servants are required to be politically aligned, itself speaks to the argument that effectively the Chinese Communist Party, its interests are the interests of China. And it wants to replace the United States as the global hegemon. If that means they use deception, wolf warrior tactics, aggression, or concession, that is a tactic to be used. But strategy is clear. On the second point, which is, of course, a very interesting point of what is happening with these companies, particularly high-tech companies, I would submit a slightly different perspective. There is no doubt there is a strong political angle to this. There is a concern that these companies are perhaps getting to a point where they might be in a position to politically challenge the regime. And this is not a factor that is limited to China. We have seen this in the case of the United States in the early 20th century when the whole antitrust legislation came about. Yes. We have seen this in Russia around the year 2000 when President Putin went behind all the oil barons and the other major plutocrats who were there. And to some extent, this is power play. But I think that while this is one reason, there is another important underlying reason. I think the Chinese leadership recognizes that in the 21st century, the age of manufacturing is over. It is the age of innovation and technology. He who innovates, he who has cutting edge technology shall dominate the world. Now, for this purpose, the essential raw material is not the raw material which is found under the ground. This raw material is data. And really the two countries which are huge repositories of data are understandably China and India. Now, the Chinese recognize that many of these companies, whether it is Didi Chuxing, the auto hiring company, or Alibaba, which is the e-platform, or these educational companies which are being now censured by the Chinese, they essentially operate on, they have enormous data stores. And by listing on the New York Stock Exchange and other stock exchanges, there is also the possibility that the foreigners will get control of a minority or eventually even a majority of these, where the data gets transferred. It is essentially my view that in order to ensure that data, which is the new gold or the new oil, remains with China, that China has taken these actions. For instance, in the case of Jack Ma, I believe that the real concern was that a private payment platform with enormous data with it was beginning to become literally a substitute for the central banking system. It was no longer just used to purchase goods. You could store money there. You could take a loan from there. In other words, conventional banking systems were being undermined by platforms like WeChat or Alipay or Paytm. And there was a possibility that by listing them abroad, others would have access to that data. Now, the Chinese interpret national security in a very, very wide way, much wider than we do or much wider than any democracy does. And partly that is because the country is the party and the party is the country. In our case, this is not the true. Whichever party gets elected becomes the government. It doesn't become the country. So I think we have to adapt our thinking to this to get our heads around the concept that the party is the country. That if the country's data goes, the party gets directly compromised. Perhaps its own security gets compromised. And therefore, they need to crack down on this, both for their own survival and because they see the future economic path which leads to Chinese domination of the world as passing through the data fields. And the data fields cannot go out of the control of the Chinese side. Now, very objectively speaking, there is some merit in this argument for us as well. We are also an enormous repository of data, whether it is disease or whether it is in terms of the choices individuals make in buying furniture and cars. In that entire spectrum, there is India is a repository of data. So to my mind, while the political motivations of what is being done to those companies is something which perhaps is not something we ought to consider, we should also not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we should remember that perhaps there is something to be learned from this as well.
That's right. But then the question is, the other part of my question was, whatever may be the fear regarding protection of data, whatever may be their ideas of national security as wide as they seem to be, as you rightly pointed out, the question is, in the process of cutting down their own companies in this manner, restricting their access, their presence on the international monetary platforms, will the Chinese, is there no possibility that the Chinese may end up killing the golden goose, killing the goose laying the golden egg, and thereby damage their own economic stability or their economic muscle, and in the end, their own aspiration of replacing the US as the only hegemon in India, hegemon in the world? I'm sorry.
So there is that possibility. There's no doubt of that. In fact, I'm actually working on this particular subject now, and I find that the real growth story of China occurred in the years where they were relatively more relaxed and less controlling than they are today. That having been said, I think we also must sort of accept the fact that the Chinese leadership has been much more skillful than the leaderships of other communist or authoritarian governments in making adjustments to policy, so that they have been able to overcome a number of challenges which other countries have been unable to overcome, whether it was moving from a socialist style economy to a capitalist style economy, or of currency controls being gradually relaxed, of the banking sector being reformed, then after the global financial crisis, even handling the whole Belt and Road situation to ensure that their banks did not become insolvent. They have a certain capacity to do so. And therefore, while the risk is high, I would say, of them killing the golden goose, as you say, I think my view is the jury is still out on this, as to whether the Chinese will kill that golden goose or they will realize that the golden goose's wings need to be clipped a bit. We are in the early stages of that process. Right. And we need to see where that plays out. But I think that we also need to identify that there is an underlying concern here, an underlying nervousness, because you don't tighten your grip on anything unless you fear that whatever is in your hand might slip out of it. Otherwise, we don't tighten our grip. We hold something normally. You tighten the grip only when either somebody is going to snatch it away or it's going to fall out. So we need to study in depth what is the motivation behind the tightening of the grip across the board. Tightening of the grip on the party, on the military side, on the media and social media side, and on the business side.
Last thing that I would like to ask you is, coming back to our main theme, how things have played out. Do you feel that the CCP's grip on power in China is safe, or there is a possibility that in the coming future, maybe not too distant future, a threat to its very sustainability or to its grip on power is likely to rise from within the people if the present situation of excessive controls is increased, enhanced, or even if it remains as it is with Xi Jinping at the helm of affairs? Is there a possibility of a serious threat arising to the Chinese regime in China?
So, essentially, it is difficult to predict what will happen going on forward from here. But one thing is clear to me, and that is both the current leader, Xi Jinping, and one of his predecessors, that is Deng Xiaoping, have publicly stated that if a challenge comes to the Communist Party of China, that challenge will come from within. Therefore, while publicly very often they accuse the West or of other democratic societies of trying to subvert them or to try to effect regime change, their real focus is towards strengthening the internal situation so that there is no problem from within the party. Nonetheless, there have to be certain conditions that exist before that internal challenge can be mounted, which probably includes some amount of socio-economic stress or difficulty. But as of now, even post-COVID, it doesn't appear as if that situation of socio-economic stress or difficulty exists for the moment. Now, nonetheless, I think there is one broader point to remember. And that is that while many people would suggest that India is an unstable government, in fact, the fact is quite the opposite. For 14 general elections, power has peacefully passed from one government to another or one leader to another without this ever being challenged. In a sense, it is one of the most stable political systems in Asia. In contrast, power has never passed peacefully in China from one leader to another, except on one occasion. And even the current leader has changed the rules of the game in 2017 by removing term limits on the presidency. In other words, there is a politically brittle system underneath the veneer of stability that the party provides. And that system has not been tested after 1989. Therefore, I think that if a situation arises where there is sufficient internal dissent, the capacity of the Indian system to withstand that dissent and to manage it is much greater, I believe, than the capacity of a Chinese system to withstand that dissent and to manage it. And I think this is where the real test will come eventually of whether or not democracy is a better means of governance, however messy or untidy it is, as compared to the so-called Beijing model.
Thank you, Gokhaleji. The last thing that I would like to ask you, on which we can conclude this, is, so therefore, would you say that you are now confident enough that our earlier phase of ad hocism or rudderless shift or drift, sense of drift on the national level, we have put that behind us for good? And from now on, at least we will not be suffering from that kind of situation anymore. And we have now become more confident and more clear about what we want to do, what we want to be our role on the international level, and we will be acting accordingly, irrespective of which political dispensation is in power.
I would certainly say that, yes. I think we have both learned from experience, and in the process also we have developed our own ways of ensuring that our national interest is protected within the international system. So I have no doubt that we will never go back to the earlier phase.
Thank you, Gokhaleji. With that confident optimism, we can conclude today's interview. And thank you once again. It has been an honor to have you on this program. And I'm sure if we invite you again, you would make it a point to come and address our audience and viewers once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor for me as well. Thank you.